This is the first lecture for Friday, April 24th. This is the second to last day of lectures, and we're moving on to this very last topic where we'll be able to spend 2 days, part of 2 days anyway, talking about humans and marine ecosystems. There are so many different people out there in terms of numbers, in terms of the effects that humans have on marine ecosystems, that it's worth spending some time talking about this subject. So along those lines, I want to talk about 6 different topics related to humans and ocean resources. First of all, some information about exploitation of the sea. Summarizing the problem that humans are faced with, the major species that are targeted for exploitation, major areas where fishing takes place, and then how do you meet these challenges of managing populations to be able to exploit them, especially in a sustainable way? That's a big problem. It's a big question. And then the future. So one of the things I want to point out is that people, in my experience, have this idea that the ocean is an unlimited resource. It's an unlimited resource, for example, to put carbon dioxide in. We're already seeing limits on that and the effects of greenhouse gases in terms of the inability of the ocean to be able to absorb all this carbon dioxide. And there's wide-scale problems with ocean acidification. Organisms, especially that incorporate calcium carbonate into their skeletons or their shells, have problems with ocean acidification, changes in pH. And in terms of food, people sometimes have the impression that there's an unlimited amount of food in the ocean, that all we have to do is get better and better at capturing this food, at acquiring this food. But we'll see, we look at the extent at which people use the ocean, that there's a lot less potential for feeding people with food from the ocean than one might think. So ever since there's been humans, how long have humans been around? You're probably thinking to yourself, 200,000 years, maybe 250,000 years, and that's exactly right. That's about how long humans, Homo sapiens, have been on Earth. All that time, this last 200,000 years or so, there's been a number of humans that have lived by the sea. They've lived at the edge of the ocean, and they've exploited ocean resources. They went along gathering clams or mussels, or they started expanding their use of the ocean, fishing, catching fish. But in terms of how we harvest food from the ocean, in some ways, if you think about what we do on land, in the old days, we used to go out and hunt for food on land. Who does that now? Even people that hunt, at least in the Western world, do it more for sport. Yeah, maybe you'd shoot a deer and have the venison and give some away to your neighbors, save some for yourself. But that's not how we eat. We raise domestic livestock, domestic crops, and we go to the store, when we go to the refrigerator. And if you compare that to the ocean, where there's some, but not very much aquaculture, then we're basically hunting wild populations. We're gathering individuals to eat from wild populations. That's pretty primitive compared to what we do on land. So if you look at the history of exploitation of resources from the ocean, then, as I said, we go and collect things from the shore. And then as there were development of boats, we'd venture out fishing with lines or nets or spears. And then there's been technological advances in our ability to navigate, our ability to travel farther from shore, and ultimately to exploit marine resources, especially from about 1950 on, shortly after World War II. There are all these technological advances that really elevated our ability to capture food, especially to fish, all over the place, distant from shore. And so, interestingly, in about the year 2000, that was the peak of harvest from the ocean. And ever since then, the amount of food that we've harvested from the ocean has trickled downward. And so here we are 20 years later, and the amount of food that we take from the ocean is still going down. People still have this idea that the ocean provides unlimited resources, that it has the potential. There's all these people starving all around the world. Well, one easy way to feed them is to utilize more food that's available from the ocean. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because the human population has gone up. More and more people need food. There's over 7 billion people. In 30 years, there's going to be something like 10 billion people. That's a lot of people. And so, as I said, people have this idea that, the ocean, we can get food from the ocean and it'll supply food for all these additional people. But the problem is that for a lot of marine resources that we're either harvesting as much as can be provided without the population's declining, or that we're over-harvesting already. And that over-harvesting, over-exploitation is leading to declines in populations of different fish, especially those that are targeted heavily. So in other words, it's difficult to imagine a scenario where we move ahead and increase our take from the ocean and be able to do that in a sustainable way. And by sustainable, I mean the populations of these different fish, or shellfish, or algae, whatever it is that we're harvesting, without those populations declining. There are a lot of different species. One of the things that we did in this class was identify, or at least recognize, the number of species of these different organisms. When we looked at, there's 60,000 different species of these, or 40,000 different species of these, or 9,000 different species of these, or the things that you guys continually liked to point out is that for some of the species, the 128 species of marine mammals, 17 species of penguins, 7 species of turtles. For fish, though, there are maybe 30,000 different species of fish. Half of those, at least, are marine fish, or they have part of their life in the ocean. Now, that is a lot of different species of fish. However, if you look at the species that we harvest, then it's really not that many. There's 4 main types. We'll look at 5 different groups of fish that represent a huge amount of the fishery in the ocean. Now, there's people that harvest seaweed. Seaweed is used in a lot of different industries. It's found in different foods. Kelp is another thing. So there's some seaweed. Now people are investigating seaweed or algae in terms of energy production, a cheap source of biofuel. There's a lot of shellfish in Rhode Island, New England. There's a big scallop fishery. There's oysters that are being cultured and that are harvested. There's a big squid fishery off of Rhode Island. It's one of the big fisheries, more squid than a lot of other things in Rhode Island. And then, of course, there's clams. And in all of New England, lobster. Historically, there was fishery for whales. Now, that didn't last very long. It wasn't really a very good idea because of the inability of whale populations to withstand heavy exploitation. And whales, like a lot of other marine mammals, it was more like a mine. They went in and got what they could, realizing that it wasn't going to be renewed. They were just going to be harvesting it, and when it was unprofitable to continue harvesting, they're going to stop. There are some fisheries like that. Whales and other marine mammals are a good example of that because they just don't reproduce very quickly. They don't rebuild their populations very quickly. Here we are hundreds of years after whaling ended on a large scale, and whale populations are still recovering. But if you look at the fisheries around the world, we're going to look at clupioids, these little bait fish for the most part, gadoids, and we have a representative right around here that used to be king in our area, which is cod. There's a bunch of rockfishes. There's mackerel and mackerel-like fish in the mackerel family. And then there's tuna. Tuna is a huge fishery, very lucrative around the world. So let's look at those different fisheries. In terms of these clupioids, it's a family, Clupidae, a fish that includes anchovies, herring, sardines, pilchard, menhaden. Now on the U.S. East Coast, menhaden, it's a huge fish. All kinds of different things eat fish, menhaden. There's a lot of herring as well, sardines. On the west coast of the U.S., sardines were a huge thing. California, Cannery Row in Monterey, John Steinbeck fame, that was a sardine cannery. Anchovies and anchovettes and these little bait fish, a huge fishery off of Peru and the west coast of South America. And off of Africa, very productive upwelling areas. It's pilchards we may not be so familiar with, but they're also these small bait fish, little filter feeding fish. This is 25 to 30% of total commercial fishery catch. Now, in the old days, this used to represent a huge amount of food for humans. They're in big schools. They're relatively close to shore, shallow water, these productive areas, upwelling, coastal, continental shelf waters. Easy to catch. This is what George Washington was out catching in Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River. These days, though, we don't eat this. Now, you might get anchovies on your pizza. You might have anchovies and salad, a Caesar salad. You might get sardines in a can. I like those canned sardines. But we certainly don't eat those like we used to. In fact, the majority, a lot of it, of these little bait fish now gets ground up and fed to chickens and pigs. And then we eat the chickens and we eat the pig. We like to eat bacon and chicken nuggets more than we like to eat anchovies or sardines. And if you were familiar with ecology, you know that there's this ecological efficiency in ecology where from one trophic level to the next, about 90% of the energy is lost. There's only, on average, a 10% efficiency of transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next. So in other words, when you feed pigs and chickens these small bait fish, you're losing 90% of the energy that's in that food. Very inefficient. It's like eating cows instead of eating grass. There's a lot of energy loss. Much more environmentally damaging to not eat a can of sardines or anchovies compared to a pig or a chicken. And if you look off the west coast of South America, this Peruvian anchovy, this population, it fluctuates yearly. El Nino has a big influence on the population of those. But it used to be a huge part of the world fisheries. Very productive, huge amount of food there. 19% of world fisheries. And now that production has gone way down. So these clupioids, it's a fish in this family of herring, basically, or herring-related fish. Hugely important, but unfortunately, in terms of environmental conservation, not very efficient use of that. Here are some of the other fisheries. Gadoids like cod, hake, pollock. Haddock is another species you can get. You can go to the grocery store and get that around here. Now these are big, these fish that have the little barbel like cod and cod-like fish. They're big fisheries, different places all around the world, in Alaska, New Zealand, off the U.S. East Coast. There's a lot of fisheries for cod or hake-like species. White fish, flaky, very doesn't taste too fishy. People like that. Rockfish is another big fishery, different places. A lot of recreational fishery for rockfish, but there's also rockfish type species that you can get in the grocery store. You can get frozen. They label it different ways. They've got these different names that don't sound very appetizing, so they make up some fake name that sounds like it's really good, like Chilean sea bass. It's something else. That's a big fishery, different places. Some of those are raised in farms. Another group is the mackerel and jacks, these fish that are like mackerel. The mackerel is a big fishery. There's a huge mackerel fishery. In fact, a lot of the mackerel, if you get a box of mackerel, I don't know why you'd get a box of mackerel, but maybe you'd get a box of mackerel. If you did, though, you might find that that box came from Kingston, North Kingstown, Rhode Island, is where a lot of mackerel is packaged and distributed around the world. You could be in Brazil and order a box of mackerel, and it would come from North Kingstown, Rhode Island. It's not all caught there, but they have these boats that are out catching very large amounts of mackerel, in addition to squid. So there's a lot of those, a lot of different species that are in that family, the mackerel family, Scombridae. And then there are tuna. Now these are a huge fishery, millions and millions of dollars for different species of tuna. Everybody wants their can of tuna. Maybe you don't like tuna. There's some tuna you can get at a restaurant. You can get tuna that you buy at the grocery store. They have frozen tuna sometimes now, even yellowfin tuna that is not so common around Rhode Island. They're offshore. You can get those, and they're raising them in tanks on the URI campus, in fact. Somebody's probably going in feeding them. They eat a lot during this coronavirus shutdown. Somebody's going in there feeding them, going to campus. But these tuna, yellowfin tuna, big eye tuna, skipjack tuna, albacore tuna, those and bluefin tuna is another one. Those are very important fisheries in a number of oceans, in the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean. There are big fisheries for tuna in the Western Pacific and the Eastern Pacific, in the Western Atlantic and the Eastern Atlantic, in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. These tuna are worth so much money that there are a number of fisheries for tuna. So let's look at how some of these tuna are captured. Some of the fisheries where thousands and thousands and thousands of tuna are captured in order to provide the opportunity for somebody to go to the grocery store, buy a can of tuna fish. So this will illustrate some of the major fisheries that are out there, the fishing fleets, international fishing fleets that travel all over the place, as well as some of the problems associated with these different fisheries. Bluefin tuna is a local popular fish, bluefin tuna. There used to be giant bluefin tuna. There's still some you can go up into Nova Scotia in the fall and fish for some giant bluefin tuna. They could weigh 1,000 pounds. That's a big tuna. Most of the bluefin tuna on the East Coast, not so big. There used to be people that could make their living as harpoon fishermen. They'd drive around on the boats with harpoons, and they would look for these big bluefin tuna that they would spear with their harpoons. They could make enough money off of a handful of bluefin tuna to support them throughout the whole year just by catching a few of them. These days, there's some bluefin tuna that make their way to Japan. for sushi, and it's kind of a novelty to get attention. But there's one fish, one bluefin tuna, that was bought for $1 million. Now, that's a lot of money for one fish. It was a big deal several years ago when there was one tuna that somebody paid $80,000 for. Then it was $100,000. But somebody just bought one fish for $1 million. Now that's a lot of money. You can imagine how many sardines you'd have to catch to raise $1 million. To be worth $1 million. So these bluefin tuna, there's a lot of concern about their populations. They were heavily fished. They're still not doing the best job in terms of management of their species. There's a lot of interest, a lot of money, a lot of effort goes towards managing bluefin tuna species populations. There's populations different parts of the world in the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's a big fishery, though. There is also drift nets that were used for tuna, not so much anymore because they're so indiscriminate and they let them float around. Not used heavily. A common thing, especially for yellowfin tuna, is purse seines. There's these purse seines where they surround a school of tuna, these tuna school together, and then they capture a bunch of tuna in this net as they pull it up tighter and tighter and surround the fish. We'll talk about the purse seiners more in a minute. But what they used to do was chase down dolphin, the marine mammals, and they would surround these dolphin with their purse seine. And then they'd pull up the net and capture everything underneath the dolphins, which would include thousands of tuna. Big tuna would chase these dolphins around, would follow the dolphin around. It was this close association between dolphin and tuna. They couldn't see the tuna. They weren't sure where the tuna was, but they could certainly see the dolphins. So they'd chase these dolphins down, surround them with a net, and then they'd let the dolphins go. There were occasional deaths with the dolphins. The fishermen would jump in the water and let the dolphins go, pull the net down. The boat would back up and pull part of the net underwater, and these dolphins would jump over the net and swim off to safety. So they were killing thousands and thousands of tuna, and they were killing a certain number of dolphins, certainly much smaller numbers. They would go to a lot of trouble not to kill the dolphins. But eventually the word got out that dolphins were being killed in this purse seine fishery that was supplying tuna. And people didn't want to buy that. So at least in the United States, there's all this, it was a big deal. All this dolphin became labeled dolphin safe. What some people thought that meant is if you bought a can of tuna fish, there wasn't any dolphin meat mixed in with it. But that's not the case. The case is that they didn't capture the tuna by chasing after these dolphins. They caught them different ways. What they do now, they don't target the dolphin, but they target some floating material like a log or some trash or something like that. They surround that, and they take out all the tuna underneath that because that attracts pelagic fish. Problem is that with the dolphin fishery, that it was mostly big tuna that would chase after the dolphins, that could keep up with the dolphins. And now they're removing an entire ecosystem because it's not just big dolphins. It's a little dolphins, some big dolphins, sharks, a whole bunch of other fish are all around this floating logs and trash and things like that. So basically they're removing an entire ecosystem from the ocean rather than capturing these big tuna and killing a handful of dolphins. So people that are strong advocates of dolphins, and certainly their populations are being negatively affected, they're happy with this dolphin safe tuna fishing method. But for everybody else that's interested in all these other things, not such a good deal. And then there's longline fisheries where they set out miles and miles and miles of this monofilament longline with thousands of hooks, and they leave it out there fishing at different depths. There's a huge fishery for tuna as well as swordfish. around the world, international fleets traveling all over the place, setting these long lines. Problem is they catch all kinds of different things. They catch millions of sharks. They catch turtles. They catch seabirds. They catch a whole bunch of other fish. And so it's not so discriminate, because you're putting out bait or you're putting out some lure for a fish that you're targeting, but there's other things that will come along and eat it. You're not discriminating what gets caught on these hooks. So here's some of those methods. There's the purse seine. So there's a purse seiner that's circling these dolphins, and below they're pulling up the purse seine, and it's when they pull it tighter and tighter and a smaller and smaller area, then you've got all these tuna that you ladle into the boat with a big giant net. But there's and they're letting the dolphins out as they're going along. But if they're fishing around logs, things like that, then it's not the tuna. It's not only tuna that are in this net, but it's everything else. And then there's long lines. They set up these long lines, the one on the top fishing for swordfish. And so they put out bait, swordfish come along and feed on these and get captured, and they catch other things as well. Down on the bottom shows some of the problems, that there's a whole bunch of sharks that are caught on long lines. There's sailfish that they're not targeting, marlin, there's birds, turtles, all kinds of different marine animals that are bycatch. And the problem is that most of these die on the long line. Some of them survive all right, but if you're an air breather like a turtle or a bird and you're stuck underwater, you're trapped underwater by being caught on a hook, then obviously you're going to die. All right, that's a good place to stop then for this first lecture, is these different kinds of fish that are targeted, because the next we're going to talk about major fishing areas in the ocean.